In occupied France, philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre was hiding from the authorities. This is the SS and the German army, having escaped from a prisoner of war camp and because he was known to be working with the resistance. In the midst of all this, he writes an essay entitled Existentialism is Humanism, published in 1945. I'll read a bit of it now. It has to do with listening to the inner voice for ethical direction regarding which choice one should make and which action one should take. He writes, "Feeling is formed by the deeds that one does. Therefore, I cannot consult feelings as a guide to action. Feeling follows action." A young man was trying to decide on a course of action in the midst of the war. Leave France to join the Free French Army forming in England, or stay with his mother in the midst of the war. The youth came to me for advice, Sartre says, and the young man said he was going to next seek counsel from a priest. But if you seek counsel from a priest, you already know more or less what he would advise. In other words, to choose an advisor is to commit oneself to that choice. Similarly, in coming to me, Sartre said, he knew what advice I, an existentialist, atheist professor, should give him, and I had one reply to make. You are free, therefore choose. That is to say, invent. No rule of general morality can show you what you ought to do. Stay with your mother or fight for your country. No signs are given in the world. Catholics will reply, "Oh, but they are signs." Very well, but still, it is I myself in every case who has to interpret the signs. Interpretation, too, is a free choice. And Sartre tells this story. When I was imprisoned, I made an acquaintance of a somewhat remarkable man, a Jesuit, who had become a member of that order in the following manner. In his life, he had suffered a succession of severe setbacks. His father had died when he was a child, leaving him in poverty, and when he had been awarded a free scholarship to a religious institution where he had been made to continually feel that he was only there because of charity. And in a consequence, having been denied several of the other distinctions that came with having the money to pay for your own schooling, he was an ungratified child. Later in life, about the age of 18, he came, he came to grief in a sentimental affair. At 22, this was the last drop. He failed his military examination. This young man then could regard himself as a total failure, and this is what he did. He saw it as a sign. He was looking at his life and looking at the events of his life, and he saw all of these disappointments, all of these failures, all of these setbacks. He might have taken refuge in bitterness and despair, Sartre writes, but he took it very cleverly for him. He saw it all in his life as a sign that he was not destined or intended for secular success, and that the only attainments that he could have, those of sanctity and of faith, were acceptable to him, and he interpreted his life as a message from God, and so became a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order. Who can doubt but that this decision as to the meaning of the signs was his and his alone? He could have interpreted the events of his life quite differently and come to different conclusions. He could, for example, have looked at his life and then become a carpenter or a revolutionary. For the decipherment of the sign, however, he bears the entire responsibility. We are responsible for our interpretations. Let us rather say, he concludes, that the moral choice is comparable to the construction of a work of art. And I mention the work of art only by way of comparison. That being understood, does anyone approach an artist when she paints a picture for not following established rules? Does one ever ask what the picture that they are working on, what it ought to be? As everyone knows, there is no predefined picture for them to make. The artist applies themselves to the composition of a picture, and the picture that ought to be made is precisely the picture that was painted. No one can tell what the painting of tomorrow will be like. One cannot judge a painting until it is done. What does that have to do with morality? We are in the same creative situation. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came around to commiserate. They said, "We are so sorry to hear that your horse ran away. This is most unfortunate." And the farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back bringing 7 wild horses with it. And everybody came back to the house and said to the old farmer, "Oh, isn't this lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." The farmer said again, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to break in one of these wild horses, and while he was riding it, he fell off and broke his leg. The neighbors then said, "Oh, that's really too bad. Oh dear, oh dear." And the farmer responded, "Maybe." The next day, conscription officers from the government came around to the village to draft men into the army, and they rejected the son because he had a broken leg. Again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" And again, he said, "Maybe." He was probably thinking about having 7 wild horses and a son with a broken leg. All of nature is an integrated process of dynamic complexity with countless variations. We are aware of some natural patterns, and we do, as human beings, we possess some degree of certainty regarding reality. But even with the help of mathematical languages and logic, there is still a maybe to our reality. After all, we are only all merely hunter-gatherer primates with some degree of self-consciousness and the ability to think in metaphors. Our civilization is founded upon the desire to overcome the inherent uncertainty of our maybe reality. And one of the ways our civilization has done that is by inventing 2 distinctly separate realities: spirit and body, spirit and matter, or body and soul. There is one, and the one is not the other. Never the twain shall meet. But such binary thinking does not fit the maybe reality that we live in. We live in uncertainty. Life is uncertainty. And we as humans, we crave certainty. We struggle for it. The struggle for certainty is part of our biological and evolutionary inheritance. Even so, we do recognize that our knowledge and actions are limited. To better understand ourselves, one action we can make is investigating the metaphors that are unique to human consciousness. They describe the nature of our human psychology. The investigation sounds kind of nerdy, but it's fun, too, to look at the metaphors by which we think. It's a pathway of recognition that defines our worldview. So if you want to know more about the way that we really think about the world, an investigation into metaphors really helps. And I got this idea from the Soul Matters handout from the Unitarian Universalist National Office for October, and it's called Deep Listenings. And so we've been having a lot of ideas about deep listenings. All of the Pastor Dave's sermon a couple of weeks ago was on this. So here's what the Soul Matters Deep Listening October has to say. Listening to your inner voice is obviously about trying to hear a message. But the often less obvious, but just as critical part, is deciding what metaphor to use to describe our inner voice. Or to put it another way, how we envision our inner voice significantly shapes what we hear. The metaphor of listening is used here as a way of understanding our thinking, pondering, contemplating, but also our feelings and memories. For instance, if we think of our inner voice as our soul speaking, we will listen quite differently than if we think of it as our heart speaking. End of quote. Sounds like the animated film Inside and Out, with the little characters inside your head. This morning I will attempt a brief interpretation of this little paragraph in The Soul Matters Deep Listening. Metaphors are absolutely essential to how humans communicate. We have to use metaphors because the limits of our thinking and our language requires it. They're essential. We cannot carry on a conversation or even think without all the metaphors. They're in there. Metaphors fill in our language when our language is insufficient. The metaphor I would like to talk about this morning, in a little more detail, is the metaphor of the inner voice. Remember the cartoons? Little devil, right? Little angel whispering in your ear. I grew up on Looney Tunes, and so there were often those kind of things. But you'll find them everywhere, like the picture on the screen. One of the most famous characterizations of the voice of our conscience is Jiminy Cricket, singing, "Let your conscience be your guide." There is the little voice, cartoonized as external to us. Monotheistic religions that believe in an immortal soul discuss the inner voice as inspiration, the thoughts of the deity speaking to us with our own voice through this spiritual faculty that we usually call the soul. It is an awareness and an interpretation of what we think and believe the message to us is. So clearly, how we imagine the source of the inner voices defines our worldview. There are other worldviews, quite different from the monotheism and the heart, soul, mind metaphors that are used. For the ancient Greeks, inspiration was the voice or presence of the muses. And there were 9 of them, and I won't go into what they all did, but poetry and painting were a couple of the muses. Very different from the monotheisms. They would teach poetry, history, music. You get the idea. The idea of the muses is more like Sartre. It is in the writing of the poetry, in the history, in the singing that proves the presence of the muse. The muse didn't come first telling the poet what to write, which is the monotheistic view, right? The inspiration, God in there telling, giving you. It's the other way around. First comes the poetry, and then that's proof that the muse of poetry had inspired you. The proof of the poem is in the poem. The proof of the presence of the muse is in the poem. Genius is not in the artist, it's in the artwork. Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird has one of the characters stating, I don't know if I could do my southern accent, people generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. God, it sounds like my Appalachian relatives. For we know how true it is that different people can look at the same event and interpret it differently. But it's also true that we can interpret our own inner voices differently. Is that what it's saying? Is that what it means? But one of the things that I wanted to think about, if you take away the metaphors, is that we're the only source. We're all the voices, and we are the only interpreter of our inner voices. Our inner voices of our consciousness is a one-person show with an audience of one listening. We decide what to say, and we interpret it the way we choose. So it makes a difference to our lives how we imagine and interpret our inner voice. A rather insecure young woman was consulting her doctor, and she says, "Doctor, I recently started talking to myself a lot, and I'm worried about my mental health." He calms her down, says, "Don't worry. People talk to themselves all the time. I do it too." And she responds, "Yeah, but you're talking to a doctor. There are other metaphors that describe how we think. But this morning, just the one about hearing the internalized voice. It's just a poetic description for our self-awareness, our self-consciousness, in the good way. We're aware of ourselves being alive, conscious. We can talk to ourselves in our thinking, and some like to specifically identify the speaker in our heads. This is what the Soul Matters was doing. Is it your soul? Is it your heart? Is it your mind? The metaphor expands and the voices of our inner dialogue become specialized. The soul is speaking spiritually. The heart is speaking emotionally. The mind is speaking rationally. And this is, for me, kind of a problem. For dualism, ideas are spiritual. Thinking is of the mind and distinct from the heart, which is emotionally physical, which is different from the soul, which is spiritual. In dualism, thoughts, beliefs, memories are spiritual faculties, enclosed and trapped, imprisoned in a physical body which feels. Never the twain shall meet. Somehow it just seems simpler to imagine one voice, because really you are all the sources of all the voices. I don't know what the value is of distinguishing different voices, since we are all the voices of our inner dialogue. And I really mean this. I don't know what the value is of making, this is my heart speaking, this is my, I don't get it. Distinguishing that one voice from the heart while another from the soul or the mind is simply metaphorical, imaginative invention. Like Sartre's young man interpreting his life within the symbolic framework of mid-20th century French Roman Catholicism, your own interpretation of all the things that happen in your head, all your memories and thoughts, imagination, those are all yours. The young man had already decided what his reality was about. God speaks to me in the events of my life. All I need to do is interpret them correctly, and I will understand God's will, because that's his worldview. That's what it was all about. He already knew that his life's failures were a message from God, subject to interpretation within his own worldview. He could have become a carpenter, Sartre says, or a revolutionary, but he became a Jesuit. That he read his life's events as a message from God to join the priesthood is what we call in philosophy the logical fallacy of confirming the antecedent. He'd already made up his mind what reality was. And then he's going to look for the proof in his life, say, see, failure, failure, failure. Only thing left open to me is spiritual things. God's telling me to become a Jesuit. Interpreting life's events as a message from God is circular reasoning. The same could be said about identifying the inner voices of our consciousness as heart, mind, or soul. This is my heart speaking. It says this because my heart is this kind of a thing. Therefore, I'm going to interpret what my heart says as this. I think that labeling our consciousness in such a way complicates what should be the very simple attitude of introspection. I think such metaphors as heart and soul have a long history and are deeply woven into the fabric of our civilization. I think there is no spiritual entity separate from our thinking that is speaking, and that we are supposed to listen to its messages. Trying to interpret our inner voice as placing some kind of message there that we have to hear is adding layers that separate us from ourselves. Let me put heart in there. Let me put mind in there. Let me put soul in there. Let me put my mom and dad in there, or the teacher, or all those voices. We give them a character. And then we interpret, oh, well, that was my teacher saying that, therefore, you get the idea. All of that circular reasoning, assigning the character in your head and then telling it what it says and then what it means, it's an echo. It's like Narcissus. We are talking to ourselves and listening to ourselves. And for Narcissus, he was his most best audience. What a handsome boy. We are our reflection in the pond. Our inner voices don't come from somewhere else. Narcissus's reflection was outside of him. But we, when we look inside and listen to our inner voice, that's all us. There is no message being delivered from another source, whether through our inner voices or seen in the events of our lives. That's the idea I got from Shakespeare, who is the source of the sermon title, "'Tis all one to me." It's all one. For myself, non-dualist philosophies like Daoism don't identify different voices like we do in the West. In fact, the Chinese character for heart and mind and soul are all the same Chinese character. They just don't go there. The mind is embodied. We don't own a body. We are a body. There is no we owning. Like the method of meditation and mindfulness, the voice is to quiet. The goal is to quiet all the voices. Right? In meditation, got the monkey mind. You're sitting there, oh, hey, what's for dinner? This seat's hard. My butt itches. Whatever. Right? How do you still all the voices? That's the challenge of meditation. That's the challenge of this kind of worldview. I rather like the radical Taoist view, and this is the end of all this kind of meditation in Zen and in Daoism. There is no one speaking, and there is no one listening. What if we decided that there is only one voice of consciousness, and that is us? There is no listening for a message from outside sources. There is no division of labor divided among imaginary separate faculties of reason, imagination, heart, mind, etc., etc. We are then not required to try to identify the various faculties and try to interpret their messages. Retire the metaphors. No heart, no mind, no soul, just us. One person whose talkative consciousness carries on a dialogue with itself. Maybe.